British colonists established a foothold in the Crown Colony of New Zealand in the 1840s, and if they did not succeed in actually defeating Maori who rebelled, they had at least kept the rebels at bay and secured the immediate zones of Pakeha settlement. By and large, the new settlers were safe because most Maori who had an opinion on the issue consented to Pakeha being where they were, on small sections of the country's coastal fringe. One reason they consented was that they did not yet see the Pakeha presence as something that would substantially change the way Maori lived or behaved. In the next 2 decades, however, the demographic, economic and political impact of the new colonists would transform the country in ways that the tangata whenua could never have foreseen. That transformation occurred at several levels simultaneously. One was in the exploration and renaming of many parts of the land. As Maori had done before them, Pakeha colonists set out to make the unknown known and to discover for themselves the country's physical resources. They imposed a high proportion of new place names, derived mainly from British places or people, on parts of the country where they established ascendancy and in places apparently devoid of Maori occupation. Among the latter, mountains, lakes and rivers were especially favoured targets. So Tamaki Makaurau became Auckland. Te Upoko o Te Ika became Port Nicholson and Wellington. Otago became Dunedin, the Gaelic name for Edinburgh, and so on. All the major rivers in Canterbury were given English names, though in time they reverted to their Maori ones. In some instances, the new names were translated back into Maori for Maori use. Akarana for Auckland, Porneke for Port Nicholson, Niuterani for New Zealand itself. The exploration and surveying of the land was another way in which, by being made known to Pakeha and subject to cadastral surveys and triangulation, fixing locations by instrumental and mathematical calculation, concepts and practices unknown to Maori, the country was being appropriated at yet another level. This appropriation was symbolic in some regions and actual in others, where ownership of specific places changed hands. Most of the coastline was surveyed by the naval vessels Acheron and Pandora between 1848 and 1855, with particular attention paid to actual or potential ports. Major investigations on land were undertaken by such figures as William Colenso, Interior of the North Island, 1841-42, Edward Shortland, Otago to Banks Peninsula, 1844, Thomas Brunner and Charles Heafy, West Coast of the South Island, 1846, Colenso again, Hawke's Bay and Inland North Island, 1843-47, Nathaniel Chalmers, Central Otago, 1853, Ferdinand Hochstetter, Geographical Surveys in the Auckland Province and Nelson Region, 1859. All the country traversed by these men, it was always men at this time, was well known to Maori, and many of them succeeded and survived only because they had Maori guides. But the journeys were made so that topographical features could be placed on otherwise blank provincial government maps, so that authorities might have some notion of which regions were suitable for farming, forestry or mineral exploitation, and so that subsequent travellers could find their way back to the geographical features described. In 1875, the central government agreed to undertake a triangulated survey of the country as a whole, and John Turnbull Thompson, who had done pioneering survey work for the Otago Provincial Administration, became the country's first Surveyor General. For the 4 years he held the position, he performed his duties with competence and distinction. At the same time as European knowledge of the country was expanding and settlers were building houses, halls and churches on land claimed from forests, they were also practicing intense colonization of the flora and fauna. This was partly the process of creating a Neo-Europe, a world that looked and felt more like the one from whence they had come, partly the business of establishing animals, pasture and grains that could be husbanded to provide food and income, both national and individual, and partly an attempt to enlarge the opportunities for recreational hunting and fishing. East Polynesian colonists had introduced kiore, kuri, dog, and half a dozen plant species. Ship rats had been hurtling ashore from the time of Cook's voyages, and the great navigator himself had left behind pigs and goats and some species of vegetable. Sealers and whalers had brought with them dogs and cats, more pigs, and more fruit and vegetables. The predation of Kiori on reptiles and on nesting and ground birds, of Kuri on flightless birds, and of Maori themselves on forest and bird life, all these had taken an ecological toll on primordial New Zealand. But it was minor compared with the environmental effects of European colonization. The great botanist Thomas Kirk estimated that the new plants introduced to New Zealand by Europeans prior to 1840 numbered a few dozen only. By 1870 there were almost 300, and by the 1930s over 1,000, of which 2/3 had arrived between 1851 and 1900. Birds, animals and fish were imported by local acclimatization societies so that, according to one of them, the sportsman and lover of nature might then enjoy the same sports and studies that make the remembrance of their former homes so dear, the country rendered more enjoyable, our tables better supplied. The Auckland Society alone brought in more than 30 varieties in its first year. Nationally, in the 1860s, introduced species included salmon, rainbow trout, Californian quail, Pinus radiata, and macrocarpa from the United States. Starlings, blackbirds, sparrows, gorse, foxgloves, rabbits, and red deer from Britain. Black swans, possums, green frogs, and eucalypts from Australia. Sheep and cattle were being introduced from the 1830s, and wool was to become the country's major export in the 19th century. Collectively, these introductions had a traumatic impact. In the words of one historian, they not only transformed the appearance of the landscape, but also changed ecologies and reduced drastically the range and population of many indigenous species. Some of the species reduced or lost died because of destruction of habitat, some because they could not coexist with introduced animals, and others because they succumbed to diseases introduced with exotic creatures. Initially poor judgments were compounded when further species were brought in to limit the disastrously prolific spread of others. Thus, farmer ecologist Herbert Guthrie Smith described the liberation of weasels, ferrets and stoats in an effort to control rabbits as trying to correct a blunder by a crime. Among the New Zealand birds that disappeared in the 19th century were the piopio, native quail, and Stevens Island wren. The latter, the only known example of a perching bird which lost its power of flight, was once common all over the country. Kiori wiped it out on the New Zealand mainland and on other offshore islands. It hung on Stevens Island until 1894, when the government built a lighthouse there and installed a lighthouse keeper. The keeper brought a cat, and almost every day the cat brought a wren to the keeper's door. In little more than a year, the entire species was exterminated by this one cat. Other birds, such as the emblematically distinctive huia and the laughing owl, followed soon after, and a much larger clutch, takahe, kakapo, kōkako, stitchbird, black robin, and others, became endangered and were brought back from the brink of extinction only via a large expenditure of ingenuity and public funds. The upokororo, or grayling, the country's most popular edible freshwater fish, also disappeared. The largest sheep runs in the country were established on the South Island golden tussock grasslands, which were often ploughed or burnt over and sowed with English grasses. In the North Island, forest had to be cleared and burnt and grass sown to make room and feed for sheep. In the country's early years as a crown colony, sheep were by far the most favoured animal for farming. Wool was easily transported and exported, meat could not yet be refrigerated, and the grass intake of one cow would feed 8 to 10 sheep. By 1858, the country had 1.5 million of them, at a time when the human population was just over 115,000. The sheep population had risen to 13.1 million by 1878, whereas over the same period cattle numbers were up from a mere 1,400 to 5,800. As far as mineral resources were concerned, every region of New Zealand hoped to find gold and coal, the one seen as the basis for genuine prosperity, the other as an essential fuel that would reduce the wasteful burning of wood. It was in an effort to discover both minerals that the Austrian geologist Hochstetter had been enticed away from his Austrian Imperial Scientific Expedition on board the naval frigate Novara in 1858-59. He wrote a favourable report on the Huntly coalfields, which would be mined systematically from the 1860s, and the books he wrote on wider New Zealand geology laid the foundation for serious study of the subject. Gold had been found near the township of Coromandel as early as 1852, but it was not discovered in easily accessible form and quantity until the strikes that opened up the Otago goldfields in 1861, and subsequently those on the west coast in the mid-1860s, and in the Hauraki district towards the end of the decade. At the same time as the land and its resources were beginning to be explored and exploited by the new colonists, so was the country's system of government. In the Crown Colony period, 1841-53, New Zealand was governed by 3 successive governors, Hobson, Fitzroy and Grey, and their executive councils. As noted previously, the councils were made up of the governor himself, the colonial secretary, the Attorney General and the Colonial Treasurer, in that order of seniority. In addition, there was a wider Legislative Council consisting of the Executive Council members, plus 3 Justices of the Peace, appointed by the Governor. This constitutional arrangement was unpopular with European colonists, especially those in the New Zealand Company settlements of Wellington and Nelson, who were dissatisfied with many of the Governor's and Executive Council decisions, particularly those involving relations with Maori, and who sought popular representation in government and ultimately self-government. In an effort to appease this demand, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Earl Grey, dispatched an extraordinarily complex constitution for George Grey, no relation, to introduce in 1846. The country was to be divided into 2 provinces, New Ulster, the North Island north of the Patea River, and New Munster, everywhere south of this line, including Wellington and the whole of the South Island. No explanation was given as to why the names of Irish provinces were being applied to a country on the other side of the world, though the north and south dispositions of the regions coincided. Each province was to have a lieutenant governor, an appointed legislative council, and a House of Representatives elected by mayors, aldermen, and councils of the province's townships. A General Assembly for the colony as a whole was to consist of the Governor-in-Chief, in the first instance Grey, a Legislative Council appointed by the Governor-in-Chief, and a House of Representatives elected by the provincial Houses of Representatives. Grey assumed the new office of Governor-in-Chief on the 1st of January 1848, shortly after he had been knighted. But he declined to enact the new constitution in full on the ground that it would give to a minority made up of one race power over a majority made up of another. He believed, and he told the British government, that Maori would not agree to such an injustice. And, of course, there had been no suggestion of Maori representation at any of the new layers of government and administration. As a consequence of Grey's reservations, the Secretary of State was persuaded to suspend for 5 years those parts of the new constitution which allowed for election to provincial and general assemblies. Grey, meanwhile, would govern on as a despot, in Keith Sinclair's words, with appointed councils only for each province and no elected or part-elected national parliament. This decision drew rancorous comment from the settlers, who, already less than satisfied with the modest degree of self-government offered, then had to endure it being whipped away from them. For all the criticism levelled at Grey at this time and subsequently, the term of his first governorship was highly successful and represents the zenith of his long career in public life in New Zealand, which was to include being governor twice and then premier in the late 1870s, making him one of only 2 New Zealanders to hold both offices. Footnote: the other, a century later, was Keith Holyoake. Returning to the text. Was he, though, as his admirers submitted, good Governor Grey? Or was he a patronising and racist autocrat, as others have claimed? George Grey became Governor of New Zealand for the first time in 1845, at the age of 33. He had already enjoyed an extraordinary career for one so young. Brought up by his mother, his father had died in the Napoleonic Wars 8 days before George was born. He had run away from his English boarding school but studied with distinction at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He served in the British Army in Ireland for 6 years and was shocked by the poverty and the powerlessness of the Irish people. One conclusion he drew from that experience was that new lands should be opened up to allow opportunities for the poor of the old world to better themselves. From 1837 to 1839, Grey led 2 expeditions of exploration in Western Australia, neither of which discovered any places or resources of significance. They were, however, adventurous. On the first, he was speared by an Aborigine, whom he shot. On the second, he was shipwrecked. In 1839, still in Western Australia, he was appointed resident magistrate at King George Sound, and that same year married Eliza Spencer, daughter of his predecessor there. Grey's contact with Aborigines gave him a lifelong interest in indigenous cultures, and a paper he wrote for the Secretary of State for the Colonies on racial amalgamation was partly responsible for his being appointed Governor of South Australia in 1840, when he was still in his 20s. He was sufficiently successful in this role to earn his first term in New Zealand, where the initial challenge was to bring to an end the war in the north, which had ignited during the term of his ineffectual predecessor, Robert Fitzroy. Having accomplished this, though with some doubt over the question of who won, Grey set about the administration of wider Maori matters with considerable skill and a strong sense of justice. He went to some lengths to ensure that the terms of the Treaty of Waitangi were observed by the Crown, and he constantly assured Maori that their land rights would be respected. With his Chief Land Purchase Commissioner Donald Maclean, Grey evolved a system of hui for the discussion of land sales to the Crown, a procedure that recognised the communal nature of tribal ownership and gave all interested parties in the negotiations an opportunity to participate. Footnote: there is some evidence that Maclean, another controversial figure in New Zealand history, also made secret deals with some Maori chiefs. It is not clear whether this would have been done with Grey's approval. Maclean would move even closer to the forefront of New Zealand public life as Minister of Native Affairs in a succession of ministries from 1869 to 1876. Returning to the text. Land bought in this manner was then on-sold to settlers at a profit to the Crown, the major method by which Grey generated government revenue. In this period, some 30 million acres of land was acquired from South Island Maori in circumstances which would be challenged by Ngai Tahu in subsequent years, and 3 million in the North Island. Grey also appointed resident magistrates in Maori areas to apply the law of the land with the help of Maori assessors. He subsidised mission schools and some Maori agricultural schemes, with money to construct flour mills, for example, and built several hospitals specifically for Maori patients. And he learned the Maori language and persuaded Maori authorities to commit their legends and traditions to writing, some of which he subsequently published. For example, Ko ngā motete me ngā hakirara o ngā Māori in 1853, and Ko ngā mahi ngā a ngā tupuna Māori in 1854. His collected papers, which eventually found their way to the Auckland Public Library, would turn out to be the largest single repository of Māori language manuscripts in the world. Grey's understanding of Māori custom in the course of his first governorship enabled him to achieve successes that would have eluded other governors or politicians. William Pember Reeves tells of an occasion when a chief refused to allow the building of a road through his territory. Grey's response was to send the gift of a carriage to the chief's sister, after which, because of the law of utu or reciprocity, authorization was forthcoming. But he was no Apollonian hero or plaster saint. He had faults. One was his tendency to exaggerate the beneficial effects of his policies in his communications with London. Another was the inclination to blame problems on others, especially his predecessors. Grey had an autocratic temperament, and when, despite his own infidelities, he suspected his wife of forming an attachment with another man, he refused to speak to her for 36 years. On the whole, however, his first term as Governor of New Zealand was well executed. The high point may well have been the acceptance by the British government in 1852 of his new draft constitution for New Zealand, which came into effect the following year, just after he had left the country. This new blueprint for governance provided for elected provincial councils, each presided over by a superintendent for Auckland, Taranaki, Wellington, Nelson, Canterbury and Otago. Later legislation allowed Hawke's Bay to separate from Wellington, 1858, Marlborough from Nelson, 1859, Southland from Otago, 1861, and Westland from Canterbury, 1873. Over and above the provincial governments, there was to be a bicameral parliament consisting of an elected House of Representatives of 24 to 42 members and an appointed Legislative Council of not fewer than 10. National legislation having passed the two houses would be signed off by an Executive Council consisting of the Governor and, eventually, a ministry chosen by the House of Representatives. The leading minister would in due course be known as the Premier, and later from 1902 as Prime Minister. To be eligible to elect members to both the provincial councils and the House of Representatives, voters had to be male owners of property valued at £50 a year or leasehold valued at £10. Elections for the House of Representatives were initially to be held every 5 years, and the House would initially have 37 members, elected by 5,849 voters, around 100 of them Maori. Footnote: by contrast, the country would have 2.6 million voters in 2003, 196,000 of them on the Maori roll. Returning to the text. The Governor would for the immediate future retain responsibility for native affairs, and foreign policy would be controlled by the Government of Great Britain. This constitution in effect brought the Crown to New Zealand and laid the foundation for the manner in which the country was to be governed for the next 150 years. There would be changes. The franchise would be extended to all Maori men in 1867 and to all women in 1893. The ballot would be secret after 1870. The property qualification would be abolished in 1879 and plural voting in 1889. There would be variations in the number of seats in the House of Representatives and in the frequency of elections, standardized at triennial after 1879, and the Legislative Council would be abolished in 1950. But the House of Representatives would persist, and those able to command majority support in it would select ministries and govern the country, and the elected leader of those majorities would be the Premier and later Prime Minister. The powers of the Governor, and after 1917, Governor-General, would be steadily reduced until by the latter part of the 20th century they could and would act solely on the advice of their ministers. They would continue to chair the Cabinet on the occasions when it acted as the Executive Council to sign parliamentary acts into law. At the very outset, the provincial councils proved more able than the National House of Representatives at finding workable coalitions of interests and personalities. But both systems became locked into a battle for supremacy that would last for 20 years. One reason affairs were initially so chaotic in the House of Representatives was that the membership was a mixture of strong personalities and varied regional interests. Another was that most of the personalities involved had had little experience of acting politically for the common good. A third was the considerable anger that the members would at first have no representation on the Executive Council, the body that would make governmental and legislative decisions for the colony as a whole. At the very first meeting of the House in May 1854, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who had arrived in New Zealand for the first time a little over a year earlier and been elected MP for the Hutt, moved that the House of Representatives be given responsible as well as representative government immediately. That is, control over appointments to and the decisions of the Executive Council. It was passed by 29 votes to 1. Footnote. In the same election, Wakefield's volatile son, Edward Jerningham Wakefield, was elected member for the Christchurch country seat. Neither member of this illustrious family had a successful parliamentary career, though Edward Jerningham, by then visibly the worse for excessive use of alcohol, was elected for another term in another Christchurch seat from 1871 to 1875. Returning to the text. The country's administrator, Robert Wynyard, filling in between Grey's departure and the arrival of the new governor, Thomas Gore Brown, put 3 members of the House unofficially on the Executive Council: James Edward Fitzgerald, the Canterbury Provincial Superintendent, and Henry Sewell and Frederick Weld, both future premiers. After 7 weeks, when it had become apparent that these first 3 ministers had no powers, they resigned. When Gore Brown arrived in 1855, however, he announced that he was authorised to introduce responsible government, and a new election for the House of Representatives was held before the end of the year. This produced the country's first responsible ministry, and first Premier Henry Sewell, appointed by the Governor with the support of the House in April 1856. The term Premier was not used officially until the beginning of the Frederick Weld ministry in 1864. The first ministry was short-lived. Sewell, a non-practising lawyer and an official of the Canterbury Association, announced that he planned to strengthen central government at the expense of the provinces. This provoked strong opposition from and around fellow lawyer and New Zealand Company official William Fox, leader in the House of what came to be called the Wellington Party, which favoured the provinces. Fox then became the country's second premier, but his ministry lasted less than a fortnight. He was outmanoeuvred by the centralist faction, which had grouped around Edward Stafford, the immensely able superintendent of Nelson. Stafford's ministry took office in May 1856 and retained power for 5 years. Fox's light was far from eclipsed, however, and he would return to office as premier 3 more times in the next 17 years. Edward Stafford, who must be given considerable credit for bedding in responsible government and demonstrating that it could work in New Zealand, despite a wide variety of competing interests and personalities, was a member of the Anglo-Irish gentry and had arrived in Nelson in 1843 to become a run holder. Success in farming, combined with the education he had received at Trinity College, Dublin, made him confident about assuming a leadership role in the Nelson settlement. He helped found the Constitutional Association there, and in 1850 he wrote a memorial sent to the British government demanding full suffrage and responsible government for the colony. He cemented his role in the establishment by marrying Emily Wakefield, daughter of Edward Gibbon's brother William, though she died young in 1857 and he remarried. Stafford had become first superintendent of Nelson in 1853, and some of his measures there, the free, secular and compulsory education system and County Roads Act, for example, became models for eventual countrywide legislation. Those who knew Stafford well and had watched the assured way he dealt with Nelson provincial business were convinced that he was the coming man for the whole colony, and he effortlessly became member of the House of Representatives for Nelson in 1855. According to his biographer, Edmund Bowen, Stafford was in his element when confronted by the first parliamentary era, with its confusion of personalities, interests and shifting cabals. His wide knowledge of constitutional history and contemporary government gave him an unmatched awareness of how the new system ought to develop and of the need to pass a body of specifically New Zealand law. From the start, his ministers met privately as a working cabinet without the governor, so reducing the Executive Council to a more formal role. Stafford was distrustful, however, of the fact that Maori affairs remained in the governor's hands, and of Gore Brown's over-reliance on the advice of his land purchasing officer, Donald Maclean. Stafford was out of the country when the Crown's invalid purchase of land at Waitara was made, and returned to find that his parliamentary colleagues were prepared to go to war if necessary to defend the arrangements, which had been made with the wrong chief. In 1861, William Fox and his Wellington-based alliance used conflict that developed in Taranaki to defeat the government in the House by 24 votes to 23. While Stafford lost on that occasion, he was to witness new ministries coming and going annually, led by Fox, Robert Browning's writer-friend Alfred Domett, Frederick Whittaker and Frederick Weld, until he regained the premiership for another 4 years from 1865 to 1869, and again in 1872. Meanwhile, the 1860s would be dominated by the second round of the New Zealand Wars, see Chapter 15, and by the effects of the long-awaited discoveries of gold in both islands. Every province in the country was keen to find ample deposits of payable gold within its own boundaries after hearing of the effects of such bonanzas in Siberia, California, and Victoria, Australia, in the 1850s. Gold was seen as the magic ingredient that would attract immigrants, transform sluggish economies, and deliver instant prosperity to all and great riches to some. To make this outcome more likely, most of the provinces offered rewards as an incentive to attract experienced prospectors and painstaking investigations. Scientists such as Hochstetter had already reported that geological and mineral configurations were favourable for the presence of gold in some parts of the country, in particular the Coromandel Peninsula, land either side of Nelson, the West Coast and Otago. Visiting whalers had found traces of gold on the Coromandel in 1842. 10 years later, a timber merchant named Charles Ring noticed gold-bearing quartz embedded in a log which he had tumbled down a riverbed behind Coromandel Harbour. Subsequent prospecting turned up further deposits, and the country's first gold rush was underway around Coromandel Township and at Cape Colville and Mercury Bay. It was short-lived, however. Little of the Coromandel gold was in the river silt. Most of it was locked up in veins of quartz, from which it was difficult and expensive to extract. Consequently, the rush lasted less than a year, and the prospectors turned their attentions elsewhere. Modest quantities of gold were found at Collingwood and Aorere near Nelson in 1857, but the real bonanza turned out to be in Otago. Gold was discovered there in the bed of the Mataura River in 1860 and at Lindis in 1861. The rush, however, was sparked by Gabriel Reed's strike in the Tuapeka district in May 1861, where he found alluvial gold shining like the stars in Orion on a dark, frosty night. Within months the word was out, and thousands of would-be gold miners flocked to the valley still known as Gabriel's Gully. Other discoveries followed at Waitahuna and further afield in central Otago, where towns sprang up literally overnight. Reed, a Tasmanian who had worked previously on the Californian and Victorian goldfields, eventually won the provincial prize of £500 for his contribution to the rush of people and prosperity that followed his find. The Otago goldfields were the most spectacularly productive, but other discoveries occurred throughout the decade. On the west coast, which had a mixture of alluvial and quartz deposits from the mid-1860s, and the coast then became the wildest frontier in the country as merchants, publicans and brothel keepers converged to share the profits. And back on the Coromandel, this time around Thames and further afield, from 1868. By 1871, there were 693 Stamper batteries crushing quartz around Thames alone, and the settlement shook day and night as if from continuous earthquakes, except on Sundays, when it was reported people were unable to rest because of the unfamiliar silence. The bonanzas came to an end in the 1870s, but dredging and sluicing kept the industry going in a modest way in Otago and on the west coast. The Martha mine in Waihi produced $4 billion worth of gold between 1879 and 1952 and reopened in 1988. Thanks to a decade of unprecedented prosperity and immigration, the population of Dunedin exploded, from 1,700 people in 1858 to 18,500 by 1874. It had by then displaced Auckland as the country's largest city. The full tallies in 1874 for cities and their suburbs were Dunedin 29,832, Auckland 27,840, Wellington 15,941, and Christchurch 14,270. Wellington had been boosted by the transfer of the capital there in 1865, a move which coincided with and contributed to a serious economic recession in Auckland. That was eventually relieved by the influx of wealth from the Thames goldfield, which by 1874 had a population of 8,000. Dunedin's new commercial preeminence was reflected in the number of mercantile companies and banks newly established there, and by a building boom on a monumental scale, which included the construction of the country's first university, founded by Robert Burns's nephew, Thomas Burns, in 1869. Footnote: other universities opened in Christchurch, Canterbury, in 1873, Auckland in 1883, and Wellington, Victoria, in 1899. Massey, Palmerston North, followed in 1964, Waikato in Hamilton in 1965, and Lincoln in 1990. Returning to the text. Many manufacturing, distribution and retail companies that later went national, Hallenstein Brothers, DIC, Sargood, Sun and Ewan, established their New Zealand bases in Dunedin. The city also developed a tradition of considerable private endowment of education and the arts, particularly through the gifts of members of the extended Hallenstein family. The latter were descended from or connected by marriage to Bendix Hallenstein, a German-born Jew who established highly successful stores on the Central Otago goldfields before moving to Dunedin. Nationally, thanks also largely to the gold rushes, the non-Māori population almost doubled in the years 1861 to 64, from 98,000 to 171,000, and had increased by another two-thirds again by 1874, 255,000. The goldfields also attracted immigrants from countries not previously represented in the New Zealand population. The 1874 census, for example, reveals that 6.06% of the population of Westland and 4.19% of that of Otago were Chinese. By contrast, no Chinese were living at this time in other parts of the country. The Irish presence, too, had increased considerably, up to 18.95% in Westland, many of whom were diggers who had followed the gold trail from California to Victoria and on to New Zealand. Their presence resulted in Irish issues being debated on the West Coast, and in the arrest and expulsion of some who supported the Fenian cause of Irish independence. It also resulted in a demand for Irish priests and bishops to serve the country's Catholic population, and in an eventual change in the character of the Church in New Zealand from a French institution to a largely Irish one. By the close of the 1860s, the country's earnings from gold were twice those derived from wool, which had been the largest export until that time. If this was all good news for the nation's future economic prosperity, and it was, even though the impact of gold would diminish steadily through the 1870s, it was undercut only by the expense and anxiety generated by the New Zealand wars in the North Island over the same period.